On January 13th, 1920, the New York Times published an editorial that would become one of the most infamous retractions in journalistic history. The editorial mocked Robert H. Goddard, a physics professor at Clark University, for suggesting that rockets could function in the vacuum of space. The Times declared that Goddard seems to lack the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools and insisted that rockets required air to push against, making space travel impossible. The newspaper's anonymous writer concluded with withering sarcasm that perhaps Professor Goddard needed to revisit basic Newtonian physics. Goddard, humiliated by the public ridicule, retreated into obsessive secrecy, sharing his work with almost no one. The Times would not print a correction until July 17, 1969, 3 days before Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, when they acknowledged that further investigation and experimentation have confirmed the findings of Isaac Newton in the 17th century, and it is now definitely established that a rocket can function in a vacuum as well as in an atmosphere. By then, Goddard had been dead for 24 years. Robert Hutchings Goddard was born on October 5, 1882, in Worcester, Massachusetts, the only child of Nahum Danford Goddard and Fannie Louise Hoyt. His father owned a machine shop, and young Robert grew up surrounded by tools, machinery, and mechanical problems. He was a sickly child suffering from stomach ailments and tuberculosis that kept him out of school for extended periods. During his convalescence, he read voraciously, particularly science fiction by H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. On October 19, 1899, while trimming branches from a cherry tree on his family's property, 17-year-old Goddard experienced what he later called his life-defining moment. Looking up at the sky, he imagined a device that could ascend to Mars, and he resolved to dedicate his life to making space travel possible. He would celebrate October 19th as his anniversary day for the rest of his life. Goddard graduated from Worcester Polytechnic Institute in 1908 with a degree in physics, then earned a Ph.D. from Clark University in 1911. His doctoral dissertation explored conduction in ionized gases, but his real passion was rocketry. He began conducting experiments with solid fuel rockets, measuring their efficiency and thrust. In 1914, he received 2 patents, one for a multi-stage rocket and another for a rocket using liquid fuel. These patents, filed when Goddard was 32 years old, described the fundamental principles that would govern all future rocket development: staged propulsion to shed weight progressively, and liquid propellants for higher efficiency than solid fuels. The patents were largely ignored. No one believed rockets had practical applications beyond fireworks and military signals. During World War I, Goddard developed a prototype tube-launched rocket weapon for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, demonstrating it at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland on November 6, 1918. The demonstration was successful, and Army observers were impressed. 5 days later, the armistice ending World War I was signed, and the Army lost interest. The rocket weapon was shelved and forgotten. Decades later, during World War II, the weapon was redeveloped independently by other engineers and became the famous Bazooka, a weapon that would prove decisive in tank warfare. Goddard's original contribution went unrecognized, another example of his work being dismissed only to be vindicated years later by others. In 1919, Goddard published a scientific paper titled A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes through the Smithsonian Institution, which had provided him with a $5,000 research grant. The paper, 69 pages of dense mathematics and physics, described how rockets could reach high altitudes and potentially escape Earth's gravity entirely. Buried near the end was a single paragraph speculating that a rocket carrying magnesium powder could reach the moon, where the powder would burn brightly enough to be seen from Earth through telescopes, proving the rocket had arrived. The Smithsonian issued a press release emphasizing this moon rocket concept, and newspapers seized on it. Headlines proclaimed that a Clark professor wanted to shoot rockets to the moon. Editorials mocked him. Comedians made jokes. The New York Times editorial was only the most prominent of dozens of attacks. The ridicule devastated Goddard. He was a shy, intensely private man who preferred laboratory work to public attention. The mockery convinced him that sharing his research was dangerous. For the rest of his life, he would work in near total secrecy, refusing to publish technical details, avoiding conferences, and jealously guarding his patents. This secrecy, while protecting him from further humiliation, also isolated him from the scientific community and prevented his work from influencing American rocket development. Goddard believed he was protecting his discoveries from competitors and skeptics. In reality, he was ensuring that his pioneering work would have minimal impact on the field he had helped to create. Goddard spent the early 1920s developing liquid fuel rockets. He understood that liquid propellants, such as gasoline and liquid oxygen, were far more efficient than solid fuels like gunpowder. Liquid fuels could be throttled, shut off, and restarted, providing control impossible with solid rockets. The challenge was building a combustion chamber that could withstand the intense heat and pressure, and designing a fuel delivery system that could reliably supply propellants to the chamber. Goddard experimented with pumps, pressure-fed systems, and various chamber designs. On December 6, 1925, he achieved a breakthrough, a static test where his rocket engine successfully lifted its own weight for 27 seconds. The engine worked. Now he needed to make it fly. On March 16, 1926, on a cold, snowy day on his Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts, Goddard launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. The rocket stood 10 feet tall, constructed from thin tubing, with the engine mounted at the top and fuel tanks at the bottom. It resembled an ungainly contraption more than a sleek missile, but Goddard's calculations predicted it would fly. At 2:30 p.m., with his wife Esther and two assistants as the only witnesses, Goddard ignited the engine. The rocket lifted off, rose 41 feet into the air, traveled 184 feet horizontally, and crashed into a frozen cabbage patch 2.5 seconds later. The flight was brief, unimpressive to anyone watching, but historic. Goddard had proven that liquid fuel rockets could fly. It was the Wright brothers' moment for rocketry, the first controlled flight of a new technology that would transform the world. Goddard continued his experiments in Massachusetts, but noise complaints from neighbors and concerns from local authorities about explosions forced him to seek a more isolated location. In 1929, after one particularly loud test caused police and firefighters to descend on his launch site, newspapers once again mocked him. Charles Lindbergh, who had followed reports of Goddard's work, visited him at Clark University to learn more. Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world, understood that the future of flight might lie in rockets. He was impressed by Goddard's meticulous approach and convinced financier Daniel Guggenheim to provide funding. In 1930, Guggenheim granted Goddard $50,000, later extended to a total of $100,000 over 4 years, enough to establish a proper research facility. In July 1930, Goddard moved to Roswell, New Mexico, where the isolated desert provided space for rocket tests, far from prying eyes and complaining neighbors. He built a workshop and launch tower at Mescalero Ranch, 12 miles northwest of Roswell, and began systematic testing. Over the next decade, Goddard launched dozens of rockets, each incorporating improvements over the last. He developed gyroscopic stabilization systems to keep rockets flying straight. He designed movable vanes in the exhaust stream to steer rockets in flight. He built turbopumps to deliver fuel at high pressure. He tested multi-stage rockets, parachute recovery systems, and payload compartments. Every innovation that would later become standard in rocketry was pioneered by Goddard in the New Mexico desert. On March 28, 1935, one of Goddard's rockets reached an altitude of 4,800 feet and a speed of 550 miles per hour, faster than any aircraft then flying. On May 31, 1935, another rocket reached 7,500 feet. These were extraordinary achievements, demonstrating that liquid fuel rockets could achieve altitudes and speeds impossible for airplanes. Yet Goddard received almost no recognition. He published a monograph in 1936 titled Liquid Propellant Rocket Development, but it contained no technical details, only general descriptions and photographs. Goddard refused to share engineering drawings or design specifications, fearing competitors would steal his work. The result was that his achievements remained largely unknown, impressive to the few who knew about them, but invisible to the broader scientific and engineering community. While Goddard worked in isolation in New Mexico, German engineers were developing their own rockets. Werner von Braun, a brilliant young engineer, had joined the German Army's rocket program in 1932, and by 1937 was technical director of the research facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. The Germans were aware of Goddard's work through his 1919 Smithsonian paper and his 1936 monograph, and they had translated and studied both documents. Whether the Germans directly copied Goddard's designs remains controversial. Von Braun later insisted they developed their rockets independently, and historians have found little evidence of direct copying. However, the similarities are striking. Both used liquid oxygen and alcohol as propellants. Both used gyroscopic guidance. Both employed turbopumps and movable vanes for steering. The German A-4 rocket, later renamed the V-2, was a masterpiece of engineering, standing 46 feet tall, weighing 27,000 pounds, and capable of carrying a 1-ton warhead over 200 miles. It was powered by a liquid fuel engine producing 56,000 pounds of thrust, far more powerful than any of Goddard's engines. The V-2 first flew successfully in October 1942, reaching an altitude of 53 miles and traveling 118 miles downrange. It was the first human-made object to reach space. On September 8, 1944, the first V-2 missiles struck London, traveling faster than sound, arriving without warning, and exploding with devastating force. Over 3,000 V-2s were launched during the war, killing an estimated 9,000 people. The rocket Goddard had envisioned as a tool for scientific exploration had become a weapon of terror. In March 1945, as World War II in Europe neared its end, Goddard was granted access to examine captured V-2 components at the Naval Research Laboratory in Maryland. He studied the parts carefully, noting the turbopumps, the combustion chamber design, the guidance system. According to witnesses, Goddard remarked that the Germans had copied his designs. Whether this was true, or whether Goddard saw similarities that confirmed his suspicions, remains debated. What is certain is that Goddard felt vindicated and bitter. For decades, he had worked in obscurity, mocked by newspapers, ignored by the military, and forced to beg for funding. Meanwhile, German engineers, drawing on similar principles, had built rockets that changed warfare. The recognition he craved remained elusive. Goddard died on August 10, 1945, in Baltimore, Maryland, at age 62, from throat cancer likely caused by years of exposure to toxic rocket exhaust. He died just days before Japan surrendered, ending World War II, and just weeks after examining the V-2 components. He never saw rockets reach space, never witnessed a satellite launch, and never knew that within 15 years humans would orbit Earth in vehicles propelled by the technology he had pioneered. His obituaries acknowledged his contributions to rocketry, but offered no sense of his true importance. The world had not yet grasped what Goddard had accomplished. After the war, the United States and Soviet Union raced to capture German rocket scientists and hardware. The Americans launched Operation Paperclip, bringing Wernher von Braun and over 120 Peenemünde engineers to the United States. The Soviets captured V-2 production facilities and built their own rockets based on German designs. American rocket development in the late 1940s and 1950s was built almost entirely on German technology, not on Goddard's work. Von Braun became the most famous rocket scientist in America, celebrated as the architect of the space program. Goddard's contributions were largely forgotten, overshadowed by the German achievements in the Cold War space race. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the United States accelerated its space program, historians and engineers began recognizing Goddard's pioneering work. NASA named its Goddard Space Flight Center in his honor in 1959. The Guggenheim Foundation and Goddard's widow, Esther, worked to preserve his papers and promote his legacy. In 1960, the U.S. government awarded Goddard's estate $1 million for the use of his patents, acknowledging his foundational contributions to rocketry. Von Braun, when asked about Goddard's influence, said, "His rockets may have been rather crude by present-day standards, but they blazed the trail and incorporated many features used in our most modern rockets and space vehicles." It was gracious but understated. Goddard had not just blazed a trail, he had invented the fundamental technology that made space exploration possible. The New York Times' belated retraction in 1969 acknowledged that Goddard had been right and the newspaper wrong. The retraction was prompted by the Apollo 11 mission, where astronauts flew to the moon in a spacecraft propelled by liquid fuel rockets, using principles Goddard had described 50 years earlier. The Times' admission that further investigation and experimentation have confirmed the findings of Isaac Newton was a masterpiece of understatement. Goddard had understood Newton perfectly in 1919. The Times had not. The correction came too late for Goddard, who had endured decades of mockery and obscurity because a newspaper had dismissed his work without understanding it. Goddard held 214 patents in rocketry, covering every aspect of rocket design from fuel pumps to guidance systems. His notebooks, preserved by Esther and donated to archives, reveal a mind of extraordinary creativity and discipline. He sketched designs, calculated trajectories, recorded test data, and refined concepts with meticulous care. He worked methodically, testing each component before integrating it into a complete system. His approach was scientific and rigorous, in contrast to the popular image of inventors as wild-eyed dreamers. Goddard was a systematic engineer who happened to be working on something so far ahead of his time that few could understand its significance. The parallels between Goddard and other pioneers are striking. Watson-Watt's radar was dismissed as impractical. Mitchell's Spitfire was mocked as a racing toy. Brunel's ships and bridges were called extravagant. Harrison's chronometer was rejected by scientists. Semmelweis's hand-washing was ridiculed by doctors. The Wright brothers were ignored by the Army. Holt's tractors were dismissed as farm equipment. Higgins' boats were opposed by the Navy. Sillard's chain reaction was dismissed as moonshine. And Goddard's rockets were mocked by the New York Times. In each case, the innovator was proven correct, often decades later, by which time the original skeptics were forgotten and the innovations had become indispensable. The pattern suggests that the greatest obstacle to progress is not technical but psychological, the refusal of authorities to consider that their understanding might be incomplete. Goddard's secrecy, born of humiliation, was both his protection and his curse. It shielded him from further mockery, but also prevented his work from influencing others. Had Goddard published detailed technical papers, shared his designs, and collaborated with other engineers, American rocket development might have progressed faster. Instead, the United States relied on captured German technology after World War II, effectively restarting from a position of ignorance despite having the world's leading rocket pioneer working in New Mexico for 2 decades. Goddard's isolation meant that his knowledge died with him, preserved only in notebooks that were not widely studied until years after his death. The contrast with the German rocket program is instructive. The Germans worked collaboratively, with teams of engineers sharing information, testing components, and building on each other's work. The Peenemünde facility employed thousands of people, from scientists to machinists, all contributing to the V-2's development. Goddard worked with a handful of assistants in a desert workshop, funding his research through private grants that were never sufficient for large-scale testing. The Germans had government backing, military urgency, and unlimited resources. Goddard had enthusiasm, genius, and isolation. The difference in outcomes was predictable. The V-2 changed warfare. Goddard's rockets flew in the desert, witnessed by a few assistants and jackrabbits. Yet Goddard's contributions were foundational. The first liquid fuel rocket flight in 1926 established that the concept worked. The development of gyroscopic stabilization, fuel pumps, and exhaust vanes provided solutions to problems that every future rocket engineer would face. Goddard's patents covered so much of rocket technology that the U.S. government eventually paid his estate for their use, acknowledging that American rockets incorporated his inventions. Without Goddard, rocket development would have happened, but it would have taken longer and followed different paths. Goddard accelerated progress by decades, even if his contributions were not recognized until after his death. The moon landing in July 1969 was Goddard's ultimate vindication. The Saturn V rocket that launched Apollo 11 used liquid oxygen and kerosene just as Goddard's rockets had. It used turbopumps, gyroscopic guidance, and staged propulsion, all concepts Goddard had pioneered. Neil Armstrong's famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," could have been dedicated to Goddard, the man who had imagined such a moment 50 years earlier while trimming a cherry tree. The journey to the moon began in Auburn, Massachusetts, on a snowy day in 1926, when a crude rocket flew for 2.5 seconds and crashed into a cabbage patch. Goddard's legacy extends beyond rocketry. He demonstrated that transformative technologies often emerge from individuals working outside established institutions, driven by vision rather than practicality. The newspapers that mocked him, the military that ignored him, and the scientists who dismissed him were protecting conventional wisdom against uncomfortable ideas. Goddard's insistence that rockets could work in a vacuum, that liquid fuels were superior to solids, and that space travel was possible challenged fundamental assumptions. Institutions resist such challenges because accepting them requires admitting error. Goddard paid the price for being correct too early. In Roswell, New Mexico, a small museum preserves Goddard's workshop, launch tower, and some of his original rockets. Visitors can see the crude tubing and hand-machined parts that constituted the world's first liquid fuel rockets. The contrast between these fragile contraptions and the massive Saturn V or space shuttle is jarring, yet the principles are identical. Goddard's rockets were proof-of-concept prototypes, demonstrating that the physics worked. Later engineers scaled up, refined, and optimized, but they were building on foundations Goddard had laid. The path from the cabbage patch in Auburn to the moon began with a professor that the New York Times said lacked high school knowledge. Goddard's story is a reminder that ridicule is not argument. The Times editorial dismissing his work was confident, condescending, and completely wrong. The editors who wrote it likely never reconsidered their position, secure in their certainty that a Clark professor who believed in moon rockets was a crackpot. Goddard, humiliated, withdrew into secrecy, limiting the impact of his work but preserving his dignity. The cost of that ridicule was immeasurable: years of isolation, delayed progress in American rocketry, and a legacy that was only recognized posthumously. The newspapers that mocked him became the punchline, immortalized as examples of journalistic hubris. When von Braun's Saturn V lifted Apollo 11 toward the moon on July 16, 1969, the German engineer reportedly said, "This is Goddard's day." It was a generous acknowledgement from the man who had overshadowed Goddard's legacy for 2 decades. Von Braun understood that he and his German colleagues had built on work begun by Goddard, even if they had arrived at similar conclusions independently. The Saturn V was the culmination of a trajectory that started in 1926, when a fragile rocket wobbled into the air for 2.5 seconds. Goddard never lived to see his vision fulfilled, but every astronaut who flew into space did so on rockets, propelled by principles he had discovered. The ridicule Goddard faced came from ignorance, not malice. The New York Times editors genuinely believed rockets could not work in a vacuum, a misconception rooted in misunderstanding Newton's third law. Goddard's work threatened that comfortable ignorance, suggesting that space travel, long considered fantasy, might be achievable. The editors responded by asserting their authority, mocking Goddard to reinforce conventional wisdom. It was easier to dismiss him than to reconsider fundamental assumptions. That pattern, repeated across history in the stories of Watson Watt, Mitchell, Brunel, Harrison, Semmelweis, the Wright brothers, Holt, Higgins, Szilard, and Goddard, reveals a disturbing truth. Expertise is often a barrier to innovation, not a facilitator. Robert Goddard died believing his work had been stolen by the Germans and ignored by his own country. He never saw rockets carry humans into space, never witnessed the moon landing, and never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. His bitterness was justified. He had conceived the technology that would define the 20th century's second half, had proven it worked, and had been mocked for his efforts. The newspapers that ridiculed him, the military that dismissed him, and the scientists who ignored him were all proven catastrophically wrong. But the vindication came too late. Goddard's story is a tragedy of vision unrecognized, genius unrewarded, and a legacy claimed posthumously. Yet his ideas launched humanity into space. Every satellite, every space probe, every crewed mission, every rocket that lifts off today uses technology Goddard pioneered. The International Space Station orbits Earth thanks to rockets descended from the Crew device that flew in 1926. Mars rovers explore another planet using propulsion systems based on Goddard's principles. Private companies like SpaceX launch satellites and astronauts using liquid fuel rockets Goddard would recognize. The newspapers mocked his dream of reaching the moon. 50 years after his death, humans returned from the moon carrying rocks. Goddard was right. The newspapers were wrong. And his ideas, dismissed and ridiculed, carried humanity to the stars.